Welcome to Conversations, a podcast provided by the Center for Thriving Leaders and sponsored by Grace Theological Seminary. I'm Dr. Trent Lambert, and we are here to help leaders thrive in ministry. Let's jump into the conversation for today. Welcome to Conversations, a podcast provided by the Center for Thriving Leaders, sponsored by Grace Theological Seminary. I am Dr. Trent Lambert, and we are here to help leaders thrive in ministry. So let's jump right into the conversation for today. And today on the Conversations podcast, I am joined here live in the studio, a special guest, Dr. Phil Cooke, recently from Malibu, California, now Nashville, Tennessee. Welcome, Dr. Cooke.
Thank you very much. We could modify it. Burbank, to be exact. I was in Burbank is where all the studios are in Hollywood. And so if you live in Malibu, you have to be rich enough that the studios will come to you, or famous enough. Steven Spielberg could pull that off. But for me, Burbank was the place to be. So it worked out very, very well.
Well, it's such an honor to have you here in our studio. I think over the last couple of days, we've been working you like a dog. We've had you at the webinars, and we did a little conference at the YMCA on some really important topics. And you spoke just a few moments ago on the Church on Trial. Before we dive into a whole bunch of stuff here, Phil, tell us about your new book.
Well, it's called Church on Trial, How to Protect Your Congregation, Mission, and Reputation During a Crisis. And, early on, I'm a media producer. I've produced in about 70 countries around the world. And over the years, we've produced everything from films to television programs, Super Bowl commercials. We mostly focus on helping the church use media more effectively to share the gospel with the culture. And so we advise and consult with churches and ministry organizations all over the country. And early on in my career, it's funny, I started getting calls from churches that were going through a crisis. Now, that could be a scandal, a moral failure, a sexual abuse situation. It could be a crisis from the outside, someone criticizing the church or protesting against it, whatever. But I learned early on that you need an attorney's advice during a crisis, but you also need the advice of a communications person, because how you communicate the news, the updates of a crisis is absolutely critical. How you tell the congregation. Do you talk to the press? Do you release a public statement? Those were the kind of questions I was getting. And before long, I was dealing with a lot of different churches.
Well, Phil, we're going to get into some topics here today that might be a little edgy for some, but we're going to challenge our listeners. Before I do that, your bio is so extensive. I've looked at several, internet bios in the back of your book.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
I mean, producer, author, speaker, you travel international, you help with communications with churches, you help pastors, you've helped countless churches across America. And so we're privileged to have you here. You're such a blessing to the body of Christ and pastors. So again, thanks for being here, Phil.
Well, I'm honored. Thank you very much. I always love, to talk to pastors especially. Like I say, my goal is to help the church use media more effectively. And most pastors, and Grace Seminary is a huge exception, most seminaries and Bible colleges don't teach this stuff. They don't, pastors graduate with no knowledge of how to use social media, how to use short films, how to use the website effectively. And so we spend a lot of time consulting, advising, working with churches to do that very thing. So I love being in a seminary that really gets it, understands how to use it, and whatever I can do to contribute, I'm in.
Well, I've used your books, and I'm going to put a little plug here for pastors and educators. I've used your books for years, Phil, in classes I've taught for whether it's church administration, church communication. I've used your books for years in various topics, and so they can probably access and find your books at philcooke.com. Is
Absolutely.
that right?
I mean, they're available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or go through my website at philcooke.com. Cooke with an E, by the way, COOKE.com. And so I'd encourage people to go check them out.
Like I said, I've used them for years in my classroom, and very valuable reads. And also, they can find your blog on your website as well, right?
Yeah, my blog, I write about issues that pastors, ministry leaders are dealing with every day, sometimes with stuff that your communication director or your media person will know about or needs to know about. So I would encourage people to check that out at philcooke.com and see what's there.
Awesome. Phil, let's get to learn more about you, I should say.
Yeah.
Let's start in just a few minutes. Tell me about your early life and how did you come to know the Lord?
I was a preacher's kid. I've been in church my whole life, as much as I can remember. Now, I grew up behind the scenes at church in the South, and I had some very interesting experiences back in those days. But Chuck Colson said something interesting about his wife. He said she could never remember when she got saved because it's all she's ever known. And that's kind of the way I am.
Mhm.
I just have, it's all I've ever known. I've never known, my testimony's terrible because I wasn't a drug addict or a gang leader or, I never got in trouble in a big way. I just grew up in the church and I absolutely loved it. And for me, the experiences, I mowed the grass at a 100-year-old cemetery. And back, as I mentioned to you earlier, back in those days, caskets were made out of wood. Over 100 years, they rot. And I had a number of experiences where I would be mowing over a cemetery or a grave, and it would just collapse under the weight of the lawnmower and fill. And I was 8, 10 years old, maybe 12. And you'd see stuff that probably a average 10-year-old shouldn't
See.
And my dad would panic. He would just say, "Oh man, you got to fix that. The family can't see that." So I'd fill it with broken pieces of wood, bricks, concrete blocks, bags of leaves, whatever I could find, put a little layer of dirt on the top, and it looked fantastic. And I was really proud of myself until I realized a few years later that when the rapture happens, that lady is never going to get out of there. But those are the kind of experience. We found a moonshine still on a trip with our Boy Scout troop from the church. It's just the church janitor taught me how to chew tobacco. So growing up in the South as a pastor's kid was a really
You were well educated.
I was
Yeah.
well edged. I have skills.
You have skills.
Yeah.
So pastor's kid.
Yep.
Went to college. Did you go to college with an intent? Hey, you know what? I'm going to be a pastor.
Yeah.
And then what kind of got you into the trajectory that you're doing today?
Never had a minute's desire or calling to be a pastor. When I was in high school, I had a bunch of buddies. By the way, I played piano back then. That was a job requirement, when you're a pastor's kid back in those days.
You were in praise and worship team. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, pretty much.
Mhm.
And it was pretty pathetic, but that's what we did. And I enrolled in college as a music major because I didn't know what else to do. But back in high school, a few years earlier, I had started making films with a group of guys. Now, my dad had a Super 8 film camera. Back in those days, it held a 3-minute roll of film, Super 8 film. And we made Army movies and space movies and mafia movies, everything you can imagine. Never in a million years did we think this is something you could do for a living. It never crossed my mind. But we made those movies, didn't even know how to edit film. I had to shoot it in a sequence that it would actually finally appear, which is really, really hard. And but when I went away to college, I thought, maybe I'll have some buddies that want to help me shoot films. And so I took my camera, took my films, and literally on the first day of college, my freshman year, a couple of the films rolled out of my suitcase as I was unpacking. And a guy across the hall, Rod Carlson, I'll never forget, said, "Hey, I'm taking a film class and I can show you how to edit those things." And I didn't even know what editing was. So we went down to the film department that very night and we were working on my little movie. And late in the evening, I discovered to my surprise, the film professor had been there and he was in the back working on a project of his own. And on his way out, he stopped at our editing booth and introduced himself and said, "Hey, I've been watching your film out of the corner of my eye. And I've got students that have been coming here for 2 to 3 years and still don't do this well. Would you mind it if I showed your film in my class tomorrow?" So I said, "Well, absolutely, if I can sit on the back row and watch." And so the next day I did. I brought in my little film. I threaded the projector, sat on the back row. They showed it. And after it was over, the class discussed it. Now, I'm sitting there having this crystal clear, what I would call a moment of revelation. I've never had it before, since, in quite the same way. That if I can do something with a camera that makes people talk like this is what I'm supposed to do with my life. So I changed my major that day, and I have never looked back. And it's been film, TV, video, the whole time.
Okay. From that moment then, because I know what you do today.
Sure.
You've got, a lot of different projects going on. Was there a moment you're thinking, okay, this skill, this thing that I'm interested in, I can use this to help the church? Was there a moment that you started to transition and begin to really help the church in that capacity?
That took a while. It's interesting. Maybe a year or two later, we were working at a conference. There was a big Christian conference we were having on the campus of the university. And they had lined up a panel to talk about Christian broadcasting, Christian television, particularly at that time, because that was a big thing back in those days. And it was funny. At the last minute, I was helping. I was just an assistant, a student, setting up chairs and doing this. And I had been working on working on, television programs and films on the side, and I'd been working really hard. And at the last minute, one of these major ministry leaders, his plane got diverted and canceled, and he couldn't get there in time for the seminar. And so somebody just grabbed me and said, "Phil, why don't you take his place? You just sit up here in the chair, just answer people's questions." And so suddenly, here I am sitting with all these major ministry leaders. And what was funny was people would ask questions about, Christian broadcasting or Christian media, and they would go down the list, and these guys were mostly inspiring. They would talk about God called them to do television or video or whatever. But when it got to me, I said, "Look, if you're serious about being on television, let me give you 3 or 4 ideas about how to make that happen." And so I did. And the minute the panel was over, people just flooded to me. I had this huge line out the door of people that wanted to ask me questions. They ignored these other high-powered, big-time pastors and evangelists and came right to me because I'd offered them real practical steps about how to do it. And so at that moment, I started to realize, whoa, people really don't know how to do this. And I think I could maybe help. And so I still wanted to go to Hollywood. I did in 1991. I went to LA and we started Cooke Media Group, our company in Hollywood. And I still wanted to do movies and television. And, we've done Super Bowl commercials and all kind of stuff. But I've always, in the core of my being, I've always understood the need that, the feeling you get doing a ketchup commercial, no matter how good it is not great. The feeling you get when you help a ministry or television ministry or a church reach potentially millions of people with media, that's a whole different experience.
Yeah. Phil, we'll share what you can, but what are some of the projects you're working on right now?
Well, we're always got 4 or 5, 6 projects in the hopper. Some of our clients have included the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., the Salvation Army, the Voice of the Martyrs. We've worked with a number of different organizations. We're talking with Help the Persecuted based in Atlanta. I have a real heart for doing documentary film and footage of that tells the story of Christian persecution overseas. We just got back from West Africa, and we were in Ghana, and we were doing a media training seminar, and many of the participants were filmmakers, Christian filmmakers, and media production people from Nigeria. And they were telling me that something like 16,000 Christians have been martyred in Nigeria in the last year. You don't see that on the news. Nobody talks about that on NBC News. It's just, totally forgotten. And so it's a huge issue. So we really try to focus on helping tell that story. But I also want to help churches and ministries engage the culture here in the U.S. more effectively as well. I just am convinced that Christianity is pretty much disappearing from the culture. And if we don't learn to speak the language of media, we're not going to stop that.
Phil, one of the things that intrigued me about your books years ago when I picked it up, and as I started reading your material, I couldn't put it down. As a pastor, I was into creative ministry. You got to be creative to reach culture.
Yeah.
And I was into real ministry. I was tired of plain church.
Yep.
Let's really be the church. Let's make impact in culture, and let's be creative doing it. So that was kind of the spark.
Good.
So in saying that, this next part of our conversation might be a little edgy, but I think, Phil, we as a church, we think, okay, we're called to ministry, we're called to the mission field, get on an airplane and let's go to Africa and minister in Africa. But I think there's a mission field here that we're overlooking. Mm-hmm. And so I think the next part of our conversation is going to be doing Hollywood and the Bible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Talk to me of what you think, because we're here in the Midwest, Phil, and so we think of Hollywood and a bunch of weirdo nuts, and they're leading America to hell.
Right.
What should we do about that, Phil?
Well, let me go back a minute. You talked about you want to be a missionary and go overseas. I have a friend, an evangelist in the UK, J. John, who has always said, "Look, you want to be a missionary? Great, go next door." People just don't realize, go next door. I saw a statistic recently that 76% of Americans don't know their neighbor's name. Maybe we just start, instead of trying to invest so much in foreign missions, and I'm all for that, but maybe we just start as believers and individually going next door. We don't even have to witness to them right away. Take them a pie, take them to dinner, just start a conversation, and then work your way up. So that's a big thing with me. But as far as Hollywood is concerned, I've been there for about 35 years, and I've discovered that Hollywood is not really anti-Christian. Let me make some people angry real quick, but Hollywood's not really anti-Christian. They just don't get it. They don't understand it. It's like most professional groups or organizations. They didn't grow up in church. They don't have a church background. They don't understand Christianity. And I have to say, it's not that weird to be a Christian in Hollywood. I mean, there are people in Hollywood that hug trees and worship rocks, so being a Christian is just not that strange. However, I've discovered that you do need to be incredibly authentic, live the life God's called you to live. And one of the things I tell young people who want to come to Hollywood and be a filmmaker or a writer, an actor, an artist, is don't lead with your faith, lead with your talent. So often I'll have young people come to Hollywood and they're flying the flag of, I'm going to change the industry for the gospel. Well, they get laughed right off the studio lot and you never hear from them again. They go back to Topeka and they're gone. But if you come out to Hollywood, if you're a committed Christian and you're an amazing writer, amazing actor, amazing director, producer, let me tell you, that will get their attention. And once you have their attention, once they respect you because of your talent, they'll listen to anything you have to say. I've never been turned down. I've never been, disrespected. I've never been, sidelined because I'm a Christian, largely because we do great work. And I think that's really the key. And it probably is the key to sharing Christ in any field, whether you're a teacher, a lawyer, work at a service station, whatever you do, be amazing in what you do. That wins people's respect. And then they'll listen to whatever you have to say.
It's interesting you say that. As we're discussing here, we have some documents here in front of us. And one note I made was Hollywood values Christian faith. And some of these quotes, for example, I wanted to be a priest. My whole life has been movies and religion. That's it, nothing else. This was a film director, Martin Scorsese.
Yeah.
And then give me any 2 pages of the Bible and I'll give you a picture. Film director Cecil DeMille. Making films solely for entertainment is like making soup with only one ingredient. David Putnam, producer of Chariots of Fire. So, even K.S. Hoover, 1911, the moving picture machine has become a preacher, and its sermons are most effective because they are addressed to the eye rather than the ear.
Yeah.
And even the staggering thing I'm reading here, LA Times reports in 9/11 that Allies invaded Afghanistan, and the first public buildings to reopen weren't hospitals, government buildings, or schools. The first public buildings to reopen after the invasion were movie theaters.
Yeah, absolutely.
Showing American films.
We don't realize the impact of media around the world. That was amazing to me when I saw that statistic that after the invasion, after the devastation, after Iraq, was just flattened, the first public buildings that reopened weren't hospitals or schools or government buildings, like you say. They were movie theaters. And that's amazing. That shows you how, the world is desperate for entertainment, for media. They love that. And so I just think, and some of the leading Martin Scorsese, Cecil B. DeMille, all of these guys will readily tell you that the Bible has been the key to most of what Hollywood has done. When you think about it, I mean, one of the greatest box office hits of all time was Passion of the Christ. Remember when Mel Gibson made that film? Yeah. And in fact, it was so funny because in the early days of film, what's interesting is from probably 1898 to about 1914, scholars will tell you that the church made more movies than Hollywood did. And I was at a church in across the Hudson River from New York City. It was a historic church built in about 1910. A congregation asked me to come in and advise them because they wanted to produce some local television things. And they were doing remodeling. It was, I think, Henry Emerson Fosdick was the first pastor of that church back in 1910. And they did some remodeling, and when they blew open the back wall of the church to expand it, they discovered a vintage movie theater or a movie projector stuck in the walls back there. And they did some research. They were shocked, and they did some research and found out back in 1910, 1915, 1920, 25, every Friday night they had movie night at the church. And they'd invite local people to come over and watch movies. They were Christian movies because so many were being made. In fact, the first movie studio in Australia was built by the Salvation Army. So the early days of the movie industry, the church was insanely active. They were doing amazing things. But what happened was in the 50s and 60s, as more violence, as more profanity, as more sexual content got, kind of easing in the movies, Christians, instead of countering it, they stepped back. And when you step back, when a vacuum happens, bad stuff comes in. And we've gotten kind of where we are today. Although I have to say, we're seeing a new generation. If you've seen The Chosen, if you've seen some of the other movies that have come out, the Jesus Revolution, there's a new generation of young Christians who are extraordinarily talented that are making some remarkable things. And it's getting the world's attention. In fact, Wall Street Journal just last week, as we tape this, last week, the Wall Street Journal did a story about Hollywood is pouring millions and millions and millions of dollars into Christian content because we finally have young Christian filmmakers who are doing some remarkable work. That's amazing.
You know, Phil, you mentioned The Chosen, and I'm in the classroom a lot and get to talk to a lot of pastors. I'm amazed at times of the reaction that we get to Chosen or some films
Yes,
from the church.
I know. Yeah,
We get pushed back.
yeah.
How would you calm the nerves of pastors and leaders about Christian films or Chosen if they're
Yeah.
quote unquote danders up on that?
Well, these filmmakers aren't recreating the Bible. They're not, this is not gospel. These are not, what those characters say, we don't put in the same category as the Bible, the written word of God. However, I think, artists throughout history, the greatest artist, Michelangelo, just a remarkable number of artists took the Bible as a starting point and created from there. And so to say that they can't film scenes from the Bible, I don't know, it just seems ridiculous to me. And it's also making the Bible come alive. The premiere of season 2, I actually went to in Hollywood, at a major theater in the heart of Los Angeles in Hollywood, and it was packed. It was a classic old theater that was huge. It must have had 3,000 or 4,000 seats, and it was absolutely packed. So it's making the Bible come alive for so many people. You mentioned, when we were talking earlier, you mentioned Noah, the Russell Crowe movie.
Yeah.
Now that took a lot of criticism, and I understand. I mean, if you saw the movie, it had rock people, and Darren Aronofsky, the director, added a lot of weird stuff to it. But I'll tell you, even no matter how weird that was, I talked to my friend Bobby Grunwald, who founded the YouVersion Bible app. He said during the time, with all the mistakes in that movie and all the non-biblical stuff in it, he said during the time it was in theaters, on YouVersion, more people accessed the Noah story. They broke records. I mean, it was
Wow.
millions of people
Wow.
started looking for the Noah story. I also called my friends at the American Bible Society. At that time, they were on Broadway in New York City, right on the main drag in New York City. They said they had thousands of people coming into their office at the American Bible Society, asking about the Noah story, and they were giving out free Old Testaments or free Bibles, and to tell them that story because people were curious. So I think, if nothing else, if we could just spark an interest in the Bible that people have never had before, how could that be wrong?
So much we hear negative things in culture. Could you talk to our listeners just a little bit about a new conversation of God happening in our culture?
Yeah. Well, I think that very often we just need to be a little bit more flexible and open to interpretations. Artists are creative. That's what they're all about. And they're bringing a new perspective to things that we probably never thought before. When you look at Rembrandt's Prodigal Son, I have it hanging in my house, an old lithograph hanging in my house. And I would have never thought to frame the picture that way, to look at it that way, from that perspective and that angle. And it's a remarkable piece of work. And so if you're going to criticize The Chosen, let's criticize Rembrandt and all the biblical scenes he created and the other artists created. So my feeling is, look, we're not recreating the Bible. We're not trying to do a word for word version that people rever at the same level that's, the infallible word of God. That's not it at all. It's just, okay, what if this was a conversation and how it happened between Jesus and Matthew? And trust me, these filmmakers will make mistakes. They're going to, come up with ideas that maybe are a little wacky, but give them a little grace, give them a little freedom, and you're going to be amazed at how many people look at that and think, you know what, maybe I need to read that story for myself. And that's when God starts working in people's lives.
Amen. Talk to us, Phil, about this idea, the power of stories.
Yeah. Well, people don't realize that, it's funny. When you think about the life of Christ, he had 3 years of adult ministry. Think about that.
Yeah.
And he was God. He knew his destiny. He knew what he was facing. Probably during that time, he should have written a book on church leadership or, how to manage a church. He should have written some better stuff. Come on. But what did he do? He risked those 3 short years on the power of stories. I mean, over and over and over again. He didn't lecture people. He didn't go into great academic detail. He just told stories. And very often, he didn't explain the point of the story. He just told the story and walked away. Sometimes the disciples were kind of dense, and he would turn around and say, okay, guys, here's what it's about. But very often he just told amazing stories. And we forget that cultures have been raised. I mean, since the days of the earliest Hebrew storytellers sitting in the sand in the desert, stories have been a vital part of our lives. And it's interesting to me that if you look at television ratings, the most popular television shows are story-based programs. They're not news, they're story-based. And so I think we just need as Christians to understand the value of stories. I know a pastor in LA, sweet guy, couldn't tell a story if his life depended on it. He'll use a PowerPoint presentation. He'll try everything else, but his sermons are dry, they're boring, there's no emotion in them because he just can't come around to telling a story. And it's missing so much. I think stories really drive people's imagination, and I think they're absolutely critical in everything that we do.
So let me just segue with what you just said, because one of the things, Phil, that we're doing here in the Center for Thriving Leaders in Grace College and Seminary is we're doing a preaching proclamation initiative to help preachers.
Yep.
Now I'm gonna throw you a curveball, Phil.
All right.
I know you're not a pastor, but you do have a PhD. So
yeah, all right.
How important is storytelling from the pulpit as a preacher?
Life and death. I mean, I can't emphasize how important it is.
Narrative preaching.
Yeah, it's simply because you're not just lecturing. You know, if you want to be in a classroom where you're lecturing on Old Testament Hebrew, great. But if you're in the pulpit where, you're trying to connect with people emotionally, you're trying to obviously convey information, but if you can convey it through the power of telling a great story, and it doesn't mean you're telling a fairy tale. When I say story, I'm not talking about a lie or a myth or a fairy tale. I'm talking about just doing it like Jesus did. Use illustrations, use examples, use stories. It just makes it come alive. It's why people love movies so much. If stories didn't work, movies would be about lectures. They'd be a shot of a guy just standing there talking about things. But they're story-based because I think people just love a great story. So I think in the pulpit, we don't have just it's not an opportunity, it's a mandate. We need to be able to integrate. And let me just say this, storytelling isn't some vague, weird, mystical thing. They're techniques for telling stories well. Mm-hmm. And it's easy to find them. You can go online. There's plenty of books on storytelling. And just to become better at it, it's amazing the impact you'll make in your ministry. I can tell you this, some of the most effective pastors I know in the country are master storytellers. There's a connection, no question.
Well, in our prep for this podcast, you made a comment to me. Don't forget the Dunkirk story.
Yes.
So you've got my curiosity, Phil. So tell me about the Dunkirk story.
Well, we used to live in a culture that was immersed in the King James Bible. Back in those days, when I was a kid, that's the only translation we really had. There were a few others, but as far as the mainstream church-going public, it was all about the King James Version. And it was true in England as well. And Christopher Hitchens, who's a famous atheist, brilliant writer, but a famous atheist, before he passed away, he wrote a remarkable story about something that happened in Dunkirk. You may remember that at the beginning of the war, the UK was entirely outclassed by Hitler and the German army. Mm-hmm. And when they went, the UK army landed, the English army landed in France, pretty much the German army drove them back to the beach. And the German army was about to completely decimate them. And so it was a desperate situation because it was more than 300,000 soldiers. And so the German high command sent a radio message to the general on the ground, on the beach in charge. And they basically asked, can you make it? Can you make it? Can you survive this? Can we get through this? And he answered in just 3 words, but if not. But if not. And everybody at the high command in London understood that it was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That famous story where they both answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. But if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image with which thou hast set up. They all knew that this general meant we're going to fight to the end. We're not giving up. But if not, we're going to go right to the end. And that's when Winston Churchill said, those guys need to be saved. And he mobilized private boats, fishing boats, commercial boats. That's when that huge rescue operation for Dunkirk happened. And they rescued the vast, vast, vast majority of those soldiers, and it kept England in the war, and they eventually beat Hitler. So it's a great story that in those days, I mean, can you think now, if one of our commanders in the Middle East or in some war in the Ukraine or some other place would radio back, but if not, our commanders would have no clue what he means. They would have no clue.
Totally.
But in those days, the entire culture was so immersed in the King James Bible, they understood it completely. And it's a powerful testimony to a culture that really understands what God's word is all about and the impact it can have.
But if not,
I'll tell you, it makes me cry every time I tell that story.
amen. Phil, let's talk about audience awareness. And so within your context of culture, filmmaking, what's audience awareness mean to you?
Audience awareness means one of the reasons Hollywood likes the Bible and does so many Bible projects, particularly recently, is even though we're a culture that is becoming more and more secular, we still have a huge understanding of biblical principles. I mean, the Imitation of Christ by Thomas at Kempis is considered probably the most widely distributed book ever. And of course, the Bible is the most published book in the history of the world. The Book of Common Prayer has 300 million copies floating around. Pilgrim's Progress, Fox's Book of Martyrs, Lord of the Rings, 150 million copies. The Hobbit, 142 million copies. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, 85 million copies. I could go down a list, but the truth is Christian content is so immersed in the public out there. It's not the way it was, back in the days of Dunkirk, but Hollywood understands that I'll tell you something interesting. Hollywood had pretty much given up on the Christian audience, and then Mel Gibson came along with The Passion of the Christ.
Yeah.
Now, what Mel did that was brilliant was, as he's producing the movie, he would go around the country and speak at Christian conferences, speak at churches, let them know it's coming, promote it, get them going. But when that movie hit, it was such a blockbuster, it really got Hollywood's attention. I think for the first time in a very, very, very long time, Hollywood realized, wow, there are millions of people out there who take their faith seriously and want to see entertainment that takes their faith seriously. In the Hollywood always referred to the Midwest as flyover states. They just fly from L.A. to New York and back, and they didn't know anything about the people and the population of the Midwest, and they were figuring that's just a flyover state. They don't matter. But I'll tell you, Passion of the Christ woke them up. In fact, they call it passion dollars, the money that came in, that box
Passion
office.
dollars.
Yeah, it really got their attention. Now, what happened was after The Passion was so super successful, a lot of Christians tried really bad projects. They tried to pitch studios because studios didn't understand. They still didn't understand Christian projects. And a lot of, incompetent Christian producers tried to pitch things that failed. And it kind of soured Hollywood again. But now we're seeing a new generation, whether it's The Chosen or whether it's Jesus Revolution or other films like that are coming out. There's a new film called House of David that's kind of patterned in the production style of Game of Thrones. That's on the David story. And it's Amazon is putting millions and millions into that, and it's Christian filmmakers behind it. So we're seeing a remarkable resurgence, I think, of Christian filmmaking, Christian content that are going to be in theaters very, very soon.
So do you believe Hollywood has an understanding of stories that transcend culture?
Oh yeah, you may hate Hollywood, but they're good at what they do. I'll tell you that. They are very good at what they do. And what we've Karen Covell founded a group in Hollywood called the Hollywood Prayer Network. And my wife, Kathleen, is on the board. And their vision is, let's stop criticizing. A lot of people go and think this is crazy, but let's stop criticizing Hollywood and let's start praying for Hollywood. What if we viewed Hollywood?
Say that again, Phil. Say that again.
Let's stop.
Because I think you just made some of our audience gulp there.
Yeah, theoretically, what if we stopped criticizing Hollywood and started praying for Hollywood? When we send missionaries to a third world country. We don't surround a village and criticize that village and hold up signs and yell at them and call them names. What do? We get to know them. We develop a relationship. We become them. And what if that happened in Hollywood? What if we really started praying for the industry? I mean, view Hollywood as a mission field. I know it's radical, it's crazy. We'll get hate mail, but view Hollywood as a mission field because God, by not doing that, we're saying God can't change it. God can't change it. And you have to admit, Hollywood is the most influential organization or group in the world. And so if we could get them to value the Christian message and value Jesus, it could change a lot.
With all this said, Phil, how should the church interact now and, its interaction with Hollywood and so on and so forth with pop culture?
Sure.
And then along with that, Phil, I guess sometimes as a churchman, as a pastor, we miss opportunities.
True.
Right. Something comes, if you look at church history, the Gutenberg press came out, that's of the devil.
Yeah.
Right. So what does pop culture look like for the church? How should the church engage that? And what kind of opportunities are out there right now for real ministry?
There are voices out there that if you don't listen to popular culture, if you're not watching secular television or some secular movies, reading some secular books, you're just going to be completely unaware of. And I think one of the greatest things the church could do is something they did during the Middle Ages, and that is become a patron of the arts.
Yeah.
The church, think about the young people in your congregation. Are there filmmakers out there? Are there talented young actors or writers? I'll bet you $1. I don't care if you have 20 or 30 people in your church. If that's all, you got somebody in there who dreams of being a filmmaker or an actor or a writer. What if you actually helped fund their education? What if you stepped up to help them with a second job or gave them a day job to help fund what they're trying to do? What if you came alongside and encouraged and mentored them? You have no idea the impact they could make. And we could send them to Hollywood and do some amazing things.
Phil, you were telling me a story the other night about the LGBTQ community.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And supporting of education. Could you share that story?
Sure. I have a friend who's a very successful writer and a director in Hollywood, and he went to graduate school at one of the big universities in LA and focused on entertainment. And in his first day of class, he told me an interesting story. He said on his first day of class, the professor said, before we start the semester, I have a guest who's going to come in and talk for just a minute. And a guy came in, very nice guy, and he said, look, I represent the Gay and Lesbian Alliance here in Hollywood. And he said, if any students in the class are gay, he said, I'd like to meet you afterwards. I'll be in the hallway outside, and I'd love to meet with you because we will pay for your education. We will mentor you while you're here. We will get you an internship while you're taking your classes in the industry, and we will guarantee you a job when you graduate. And I thought, whoa. My friend said, I almost thought about becoming gay. Yeah, he said, I almost thought about becoming gay. But the point is, they're strategic. We wonder why the gay community has such influence in Hollywood. They're strategic. I mean, what if that had been a Christian guy saying, are there any Christian students in this class? We'll pay for your education. We'll mentor you while you're here. We'll guarantee you a job when you get out. I'll tell you, that would change some things. I think as Christians, if we're going to tackle an industry like Hollywood that's so influential and so important, we're going to need to be very strategic. It's not about just giving money to some guy with an idea. It's about sitting back and thinking, okay, how can we really focus our efforts and be strategic in making an impact?
I'm going to read a quote here. Craig Detweiler. Hopefully I said that name.
Friend of mine. Yes, he is.
Quote, this generation wants Jesus unplugged, complete with the radical claims, unexplainable miracles, and a savage, bloody death.
Yeah.
Explain that. Unpack that.
Craig's a filmmaker. He also teaches at Grand Canyon University and strong Christian. And he thinks, his feeling is when we have made Christian movies, books, novels in the past, we've sanitized them. We don't want profanity in there. We don't want any sex or any, provocative stuff, any violence. And the world looks at that and goes, that's just not real. That's not the way the world works. So this generation of young Christians wants to tell the real story. I mean, obviously there are scenes in the Bible that if you tried to film, they'd be X-rated.
Could you imagine making the Book of Judges as a movie?
Yeah, super violent. Song of Solomon. try to shoot the scene where David delivered 100 Philistine foreskins to King Saul. How do you film that? The Bible is real. The Bible is authentic. And yet when we make movies and books and novels and things, we want to sanitize that. We're just so afraid we'll offend somebody. And I think we have a younger generation that's saying, tell it the way the Bible tells it. We want it real. We want the real thing. So I think Craig articulates that very, very well.
And then the concept, engage today's culture even when it's uncomfortable.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a great statement. Even when it's uncomfortable, we have to be willing to talk to people about Jesus who we normally wouldn't associate with or be uncomfortable with. And I think it's the only way to reach out.
Now, Phil, I know the response on this is going to have a mixed review.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
But expand and talk about type of movies we should be supporting.
Well, I think, it's interesting. I wrote my PhD, my doctoral dissertation on we've got to stop only looking at movies that, are evaluating movies by the number of swear words or the number of sex scenes or the amount of violence in there. There's some powerful, powerful movies out there that are a whole lot more edgy than that. I'm thinking of Shawshank Redemption, an amazing story. It has a homosexual rape scene. It has profanity in it, and yet it's one of those powerful movies I've ever seen. Schindler's List, about the, Nazi concentration camps. There's nudity in that film because they were stripping women and they were doing all kinds of horrible things, and yet it's an incredibly powerful, redemptive film. And I think if we're willing to take a look and explore some of these areas that are uncomfortable, it might change the way. Now, let me just say, I'm not asking you to go make X-rated films. I'm not asking you to get super violent. I'm not asking you to just, it's not, we shouldn't ever do gratuitous violence, gratuitous profanity, gratuitous sex, anything like that. We're not doing it just to do it. We're doing it to help tell the story. You couldn't tell the story of David and Bathsheba without knowing they slept together. They committed adultery. Whoever's fault it was, David or hers, however you want to portray it, it was probably David because he had the power dynamic thing there. He was king. But the fact is, these kind of stories need to be told the way they really happened if people are going to believe them.
Amen. Phil, I think we've challenged our listeners today on some topics. And I want this last question and thought for you. As I've read your books, I've been challenged to how I communicate my story and how I think about culture. And it's really impacted how I've taught some various courses, how I've pastored. So I want to ask you one last question. As we have some pastors and ministry leaders listening to us today, what last nugget of truth, piece of wisdom, advice would you give them today in relation to whether it's filmmaking, reaching their culture, tapping in, being real? How can they reach their culture today?
Well, a number of ways. I think primarily what I would say is first connect with culture. Connect with culture. Go see some movies, and if you've got teenage kids, if you've got 20-something kids, get their advice. Talk to them about it. And go see some films to kind of expand your horizon. If you're going to be responsive to the people in your congregation, it doesn't mean you have to go to a bar and get drunk or go to a strip club or all that stuff. It just means expand your horizon a little bit. Read things you don't normally read. Watch television programs you don't normally watch. First of all, do that and expand. And then I would encourage you to get involved in social media. If you may be doing it now, but take the time to explore it. Most pastors have their secretary posting for them or somebody else posting for them. I'd encourage you to get in there and just see how it works, play around with it, post some things yourself, and, stop just promoting things on social media. Start ministering to people on social media. What if we use that as a tool for evangelism? I have a friend in Atlanta that's the social media director for a very successful church, and he started looking for hashtags in his community like hashtag new in town or hashtag moving day and reaching out to those people and saying, hey, welcome to the community. We'd love to help. Can we send a truck over? Can we send some volunteers to come help you unpack? And he said, after years of doing that, he said, you have no idea the number of people in our church today because I reached out to them through social media. So it's a powerful tool. And I would encourage people, just step in, put your toe in the water, experiment with it. And I would say this, if you have a local Christian university near you with a communication department or a film department or a really good seminary like Grace, talk to them, get their advice. They could really make a difference for how you engage culture, and it could wholly, completely change your perspective.
Yeah. And Phil, all these things that we've talked about has the end goal of leading someone to the saving message of Jesus Christ.
Absolutely. No question.
That these things help promote the kingdom, and this is how we can be involved. Dr. Phil Cooke, thank you so much for being here at Grace College and Seminary in the little town of Winona Lake. Thanks for being here in our podcast.
It's been great. Great questions, by the way. Really, really good job, Trent.
This is Dr. Trent Lambert with the Center for Thriving Leaders and Grace Theological Seminary, challenging you to keep thriving in ministry. Thanks for joining us. Hope you listen next time. This is Dr. Trent Lambert with the Center for Thriving Leaders and Grace Theological Seminary, challenging you to keep thriving in ministry. Thanks for joining us today.